More than a year after the 2020 presidential election, many election officials say they still face threats and harassment from those upset about the results. According to a survey conducted last April by the Brennan Center for Justice, 17% of election officials say they have been threatened because of their job. Another 32% say their job has made them feel unsafe. For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News political reporter Adam Brewster. He's been speaking with election officials in key battleground states about this. Adam, welcome. So what kind of harassment and treatment have these election officials been subjected to post the election?
Well, I mean, certainly a lot of it has appeared online and in voicemails. I've seen threatening emails that election officials received, heard threatening voicemails that they've received. Much of this has also happened with threatening messages conveyed over social media. But there's also been examples of, threats around offices or even outside of election officials' homes. Has prompted some officials to have to leave their homes for periods of time because they didn't necessarily feel safe staying there. Claire Woodall-Vogue, who was the executive director for the City of Milwaukee Election Commission, received emails after some emails were released that she sent over the summer that, said that she should be hung, and a letter that went to her home accusing her of being a traitor, and that caused her to leave the state for about 10 days. So it has been a variety of threats, and officials said that closer to the election last year, many of them were much more specific and graphic than they are at this point, but that those threats are continuing and ongoing with us, entering a midterm election year with contentious primaries and general election.
Well, Adam, are there any specific states where workers seem to receive threats more than others?
Certainly the battleground states have seen many of these threats, right? The states that were closely contested in the presidential election. I spoke to officials in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Certainly Georgia and Arizona, officials there have faced many threats as well for their work, particularly in Arizona, pushing back against the ballot review that was led by the Arizona Senate Republicans in Maricopa County. But there have been, officials in other states where the election, quite frankly, wasn't close, and even, places where Republicans did well, where local officials, have, faced threats or said, the climate is not one with which that they want to continue working in that line of work. Places like Colorado, like Texas, like Florida, like Vermont. This is, something that is probably most intense in those closely contested battleground states, the states that will be watching again as we head towards November 2022, but certainly what were hotly contested last year during the presidential cycle.
Well, that same Brennan Center for Justice survey I mentioned earlier found almost 80% of polled election officials believe the government should provide them with protection and security services when needed. What has been the response at the state and federal level to address these concerns?
Certainly, there are many experts who say that the government could be doing more to protect these election officials. The Justice Department over the summer did put together a task force that said it was going to be investigating these threats. But the issue is it's sometimes hard to hold people accountable for them, Elaine. There can be a fine line between what is protected speech and what is an actionable threat, and those can be hard to prosecute and hard to charge someone with. Reuters has done a really good job sort of going through many of the threats that officials have faced and, asking, legal experts whether they are protected speech or whether they constitute a true threat. And Reuters has found that only 4 people since November 2020 have been charged with, threats against election officials. And so, there are instances where election officials said that their local law enforcement has stepped up and protected them. Al Schmidt, who was on the Philadelphia City Commission, which oversees elections in Philadelphia, he recently stepped down at the end of last year. He said it wasn't because of the threats, because he still is working in the election space, but found a new opportunity and chance to move on and sort of be involved in elections in a different way. But his children were facing threats after the 2020 election, and he credits the Philadelphia police, for stepping up and helping to keep them safe. Certainly we've heard about people, I'm in Michigan, around the Detroit area, election officials who, were harassed in various forms, and Detroit police had to get involved and sort of step up security. So we have seen local law enforcement step up and have to beef up security. In Milwaukee, they're looking at making security upgrades to their offices. But certainly there are questions about what can be done from an accountability standpoint for people who have made these threats.
It's troubling to hear that those kinds of steps have to be taken. Well, Adam, I know you spoke to experts who say they fear these threats will lead to election officials leaving their jobs. What could be some of the long-lasting implications of this on our overall election process?
Certainly that is one of the big concerns, right? That many of these election officials say that they have resolve and that their colleagues have resolve, and they don't want to give in to these sort of threats that they're facing. But everyone is human and has breaking points. And David Becker from the Center of Election Innovation and Research has said that he's worried about losing a generation of election administration experience. And the concern there is who replaces those people, right? Are there people with more partisan leanings? Will people who are younger want to go into working in elections knowing the climate that they're going to be entering into? There are many concerns about whether this will reduce the amount of professional, nonpartisan people who oversee elections because they just don't see it as something that's worth entering, and whether that will open the door for more partisan people to be involved. And David Becker said the more you remove the professionalism, the more likely it is that there's chaos and confusion in these very critical post-election periods. We all remember those in the weeks that followed after the 2020 election.
Yes, quite vividly. So then, Adam, given the current landscape, how are election workers you've been speaking with preparing for the upcoming midterms?
Certainly, they are doing what they can to try to fight mis and disinformation. Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, spoke about that. I mentioned that in Milwaukee, they're making security upgrades to their election offices. But part of it is also, potentially trying to get some of the situations fixed. I mentioned I spoke with Claire Woodall-Vogue from Milwaukee, who said she's worried about her safety heading into 2020 because it's going to be a much more local election. She fears that may bring out more intense passions for this, right? They have a big race for governor, a big race for U.S. Senate in Wisconsin. And she said, unless there's rule changes to sort of allow Wisconsin to process its ballots earlier, Milwaukee's results are going to come in the middle of the night again. It did in 2018 as well during the governor's race. And she fears, she is saying that now, and she was saying that months before 2020, and still face threats afterwards because people just didn't, believe that things were done the right way, even though she said for months, these are going to come in the middle of the night. And she said that that's one of my concerns, is that the rules that need to change to perhaps alleviate some of this mistrust won't necessarily be changed. So I'm imagining you're going to see some intense lobbying efforts from election officials to sort of alleviate those pressures on them, things that are just out of their control at this moment, to allow them to perhaps get their counting done a little bit faster.
Right, because we know there are some people who remain deeply skeptical and suspicious, and when they saw those numbers change very quickly overnight, as you mentioned, those are the kinds of things that they point to without evidence necessarily, but point to as being reasons for continued suspicion. All right, Adam Brewster, I know you'll continue to follow it. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thanks, Elaine.